Hey everybody, welcome to another show of Mr. Mum's World Speaks, where we speak on food, family, friends, fun, and fur. Two-legged and four-legged, not necessarily in that order. Hey, today we have a great show. My friend of, I don't know how many years now, it's got to be 10, 11 years, something to that effect. Cory Cassel is joining us all the way from Japan. This man has lived a life that I can only envy and aspire to, in the fact that he's traveled, he's done so many things. So let me welcome Cory Cassel, all the way from Japan. Cory, thank you for joining us today. Where are you exactly? Because I know you're not in a big city right now.
Well, thank you, Russell, and konnichiwa, everybody, from Akita, Japan. Akita, Japan is located about 700 kilometers north of Tokyo. It's one of the least densely populated prefectures in Japan. And Akita, you might recognize that name from the Akita Inu, the Akita dogs, as they're known in North America. But Akita is actually the birthplace of the Akita dog breed. So wow. We're up here in the beautiful countryside of Japan, a long way from Tokyo.
My mind is just going because there's so many questions I have to ask you. But you know what? One of the big topics right now is COVID. And I know every country is doing different things. And in fact, part of this conversation that I'm having with you is one that I'm very blessed to have many friends across the world. And so why don't you tell us from different perspectives, from the smaller, more rural place that you're at, but then again, the larger centers, and then as a whole, what is Japan doing, and what does it look like just from Joe Average? What does COVID look like?
Sure. Well, I think when we talk about Japan and COVID, most people will remember at the very beginning of the pandemic when it started, that Japan was one of the first countries that was in the news. The cruise ship that was docked in Yokohama was one of the first kind of epicenters of the spread of the virus. And this was a cruise ship that came into the port in Yokohama just as the virus was breaking out through Asia, and the Japanese government chose to keep the cruise ship docked in its port, and subsequently there was a massive outbreak on the ship. Hundreds of people were contracted the virus on the ship and were stranded. They kept them on that ship for weeks and weeks on end. Beyond that, Japan has been in a very unique situation in that it hasn't really seen the virus take hold as it has in many other parts of the country, of the world. And I've done a lot of research. I've talked to a lot of people as to why that might be. And the best that I can come up with, Russell, is that, Japan culturally is kind of pandemic ready. Right. If you think of a lot of the cultural norms in Japan, the very first thing, the kind of the stereotype of an Asian country is they don't shake hands, they bow. Right. And so that whole concept of physical distancing, and in that case, it is social distancing. Sure. Yeah. Because in a North American culture, we shake hands to introduce ourselves socially. In Europe, you hug and you kiss. In Japan, socially, you bow. You right. Keep your distance and you bow. Not only that, but things like face masks. I noted about 12 or 13 years ago when I first started coming to Japan that people commonly wore face masks. And when I asked what was the mask all about, like the air is clean, What are they worried about breathing in? In fact, it wasn't about breathing anything in. It was about breathing out. And a cultural norm in Japan for many decades is that if you're not well, if you're not feeling well, if you're showing symptoms, you put a mask on out of a sign of respect for the people that you're going to come in contact with. So, you know, when we enter into a pandemic where there's virus, you know, coming out of our mouths and spreading through the air, Japanese people do not think twice about putting on a face mask.
Yeah.
You know, we talk about the big centers like Tokyo, you know, the subway systems, and we've all seen pictures and videos of what it's like to be crowded in on the subways of Tokyo.
Right. Yeah.
But why isn't the virus spreading there? Well, interestingly enough, when you're on the subway in Tokyo, you don't speak. It is seen as impolite to speak or make noise or even to talk on your phone. There are signs in the trains that ask you to please be quiet, don't talk on your cell phone, and Japanese people respect that. So if you have a train full of people who aren't speaking, who aren't opening their mouths, there's not a lot of droplets coming out into the air. So just these normal cultural behaviors that the Japanese people are used to and have practiced for you know decades, lend itself to preventing a massive outbreak of the virus.
So we're 7 months, almost 8 months into COVID.
Yeah.
So has there, so the initial kind of cruise ship, have we seen much of a rise other than the initial? Because now in other countries, it's starting to go on the rise again.
Right. Well, again, when we talk about the cruise ship, let's remember that those weren't actually Japanese people.
Correct.
Those were tourists from around the world who happened to be stuck on a cruise ship in a port in Japan. Beyond the cruise ship, though, and I like to relate it this way, you know, the numbers change every day. So, you know, I don't like to talk numbers in fear that I won't be accurate on the numbers. But the way that I can relate it, you know, Japan is a country of about 120 million people.
Wow.
Roughly 3 times the population of Canada.
Right.
And consistently throughout this pandemic, the numbers have shown that the number of cases of COVID within the Japanese population is about 25 to 30% of what we're seeing in Canada. Right. So you have a population that's 3 times the size, but an infection rate that's 3 times less than what we're seeing in Canada.
Sure.
So by any you know account, the spread of the virus in Japan has been very, very low. Tokyo itself, the greater Tokyo, the metro Tokyo area, the city, it has almost 40 million people in it. You know, so that one metropolitan area has roughly the same population densely situated within one area that's spread throughout all of Canada. Sure. And again, you know, we talk about the nation of Japan as a whole having a third of the cases. Most of those are concentrated within Tokyo, but again, now we're almost apples to apples, 40 million to 40 million. You know, maybe 25% of the total cases, and the death rate is much less than what we're seeing in many parts of the world, which is curious because Japan has one of the oldest populations on Earth. So you would think, as we've seen around the world, that it's mostly the elderly population that's most vulnerable to this virus. I think it really speaks, again, to the cultural behaviors and the cultural norms of the country, but also the health and well-being of the citizens here in Japan. We do know that Japan has among the oldest population on Earth. the oldest person in Japan, actually, just last week, I saw an article, 117 years old.
Yowza. Good
She's
Lord.
now broke the Guinness World Record for the oldest living person. And, you know, we talk about their health and their diet and all of that. Well, this old girl, she had a Coca-Cola on her birthday, on her 117th birthday. But I think it just really goes to show that, you know, society, culture, behaviors really, really do make a difference when we're talking about, you know, things like viruses and even the natural disasters that happen in Japan on a regular basis. The wind is up today. There's another typhoon on its way. The Japanese people just react much, much differently, and in most cases are much more prepared for these sort of events.
So saying that, following on that lines, you know, here in Canada, specifically where we live is Surrey, Vancouver. A lot of the grocery stores are now mandatory masks. They're you know, gloves in a lot of situations. The interesting piece is that businesses such as my own, the catering industry, have really taken a hit. We've pivoted. We've been very blessed in pivoting quick enough. But we're now shut down again. And the interesting piece is that our kids are in school. So you can't get together in a catering situation, but we can put 700 kids back into a school. It's really kind of, and so again, BC in itself as part of Canada is probably one of the best situated in actually dealing with COVID and maintaining, you know, our numbers at a relatively low scenario. But again, it makes you wonder, as you've pointed out, about a country that is 3 times as large as ours. You know, why are we not seeing some of the results like Japan? And it's because I don't know. Well, in my opinion, I think we didn't shut it down totally for long enough. That's my personal opinion. Again, I don't know. But what does that look like? So in the stores, in the churches, in the, you know, are they still all wearing masks? Do you still have any type of quarantine or lockdown? Is there still a travel ban? I think there is, because I would imagine you would be home by now. So yeah, what does that look like?
Well, it's funny when you talk about mandatory and shutdowns and stuff like that. One thing about Japan is very, they're very sensitive to making anything mandatory. Right. And that really to me centers around the whole concept of personal responsibility for the good of the society as a whole. So, Russell, there has been nothing mandatory. There has been no lockdown, nothing like that. There have been advice given. There have been suggestions made. The government has asked people to please refrain from doing certain things, but never in this 7 months of a pandemic has there been an order or a mandatory shutdown of anything. In the grocery stores, yes, even here in Akita, you know, where there's not, to be honest with you, there's not a lot of people coming and going from other parts of the country. It's just, you know, as much as we're working to create Akita as a tourist destination, it's just not a hot spot for visitors. Sure. So there's not a lot of opportunity for the virus to come into Akita. But even having said that, yes, you go into the grocery stores, people are wearing masks. There are, you know, marks on the floor asking people to stay physically distant. There is, you know, plastic shields in front of all the tills in Japan. And so that is very much out there and part of it, but it's part of life. Right. They Japanese people seem to be able to roll with it. Mm-hmm. And you know, so there's a virus out there. We need to wear a mask. Okay, we're going to wear a mask.
Yeah.
It is the way it is. So yeah, it's in terms of a travel ban, Japan did close its borders I think it was actually early April. They completely shut the international borders down to disallow any entry of anyone who is not a Japanese citizen. And in fact, even people who were permanent residents who happened to be out of the country when the shutdown happened, those permanent residents were not allowed in until I think it was July or August. They finally lifted that. So, and I think maybe, part of the benefit of being an island country is that your points of entry, you're able to control those.
Right.
Currently, right now, when you do land in an international airport, even a Japanese citizen is required to take a COVID test.
Sure.
Interesting. I don't understand why Japan is able to give you your COVID test result within 30 minutes.
Right.
But that is the case. We have a friend actually who's from Akita here who has restaurants in San Diego. And he's been actually back and forth a few times in the last 7 months. And we got together with him yesterday and he said, you know what? You land at the airport. They do a COVID test. There's an area of the airport where you're held while your COVID test comes back. When your test comes back, if it's negative, they request that you do not take public transit back. So, he's had to rent a vehicle and make the 9-hour drive up every time. But they've been able to control the entry points and much better than I think a lot of other countries. And they've also been less hesitant to just have a complete shutdown, which of the borders, which is very interesting because, as you know, Tokyo was supposed to host the Olympics in 2020.
Right. Yeah.
And this country was relying on that event to really give it a huge economic boost as Japan makes the transition from kind of an industrial manufacturing country to a more of a tourist destination.
Right.
And so it was it was interesting that it was when the decision was made to postpone the Olympics, it was almost immediate that the borders were shut down. So beyond that, the domestic travel within the country, there was a request, especially during the holiday seasons. There's 2 or 3 kind of major holiday seasons that I would liken to the Christmas season in Canada and North America. Yeah. So one is the first week of May is called Golden Week. It's 5 days of national holiday, and that's when a lot of people move around the country and they go home. That was when the state of emergency was declared, was just before Golden Week. And the idea of declaring the state of emergency was to discourage people, especially from Tokyo and Osaka, going home into the country, into places like Akita, and bringing the virus with them.
Right.
And domestic travel, again, it wasn't a shutdown. It wasn't an order. It was a please don't travel. Yosuke works at the airport that's about 15 minutes from our house. It's just a small regional airport, one of 2 in Akita. It's down about 97% since the pandemic struck. And again, that is not through any mandated order from the government. That is just from the government saying, please, we ask that you don't go home for the holidays, that you stay in Tokyo, you stay in Osaka, and you don't take the virus home to grandma and grandpa.
Right.
Is basically what it is, and that's how they've moved forward. So
what is the because here in BC, well, in Canada, all over the world, I'm sure, but what does the economy look like? Here we have, great bailouts. Many of our citizens have gotten what we call CERB over here, which is a $2,000 kind of relief, which is now over, I believe, at the end of this month or potentially next month. And then they move into an unemployment or EI situation here. There was small business packages, buyouts or bailouts, if you want, $40,000 where you would have to repay 10 after 2 years. What does that look like in Japan? Does the government support, if you will, their people? Because I'm sure that there's had to have been a lot of businesses. Well, certainly the travel industry has suffered quite, a lot. So what does that look like financially?
The support of the government towards individuals during the pandemic has been very light. I would say almost non-existent. In May, just when they did declare the state of emergency and asked people to kind of shut down over the holidays, there was a $1,000 equivalent of $1,000 check that was sent to each resident in Japan. So if you're a citizen or a registered resident of Japan, it was actually a very onerous process. Again, we think of Japan as being very technologically advanced. Yosuke was downloading forms and having to print them off and fill them out and take them in, mail it in to the city office in order to get his $1,000 check. He spent better part of an afternoon. And again, the whole process of finding it online and downloading it and all of that was not easy by any stretch of the imagination, not like what I've heard in Canada where, it's a 2 or 3 minute process to apply for your
bing, boom. Yeah.
And within 2 to 3 days, it's in your account. Nothing like that whatsoever here. So a one-time, kind of bonus check, if you will, of about $1,000.
So how are people living then? How are people getting by?
Again, Russell, there hasn't been a total shutdown. So the people that have been most affected, again, as you can relate to, the restaurant industry. And it wasn't because restaurants were ordered to shut down. It was because people just weren't going out.
Right, yeah.
Interesting enough as well, Japan is not a country of takeout. Takeout, delivery, to be honest with you, restaurant owners and chefs, they don't want their food leaving because it's a lot about presentation and they have their quality, right? So even taking home a doggy bag, if you will, at the end of your meal, that's just not something that was done before.
Has it changed?
It has. It has changed big time. And that's where a lot of the cities have taken it upon themselves to work with the restaurants to create initiatives around takeout. And so while most of the restaurants did not close, they have closed to in-store service and have adapted to takeout. I even noticed there is a company in down south, in one of the prefectures down south, like an Uber company that is now offering delivery service. Wow. And again, even the one takeout pizza joint that we have in our area has never offered delivery service. It's pickup service. But they're starting, especially in the big urban areas, to now do delivery. So, that's been something that's been kind of exciting to see happen, is that we now can order takeout and in some cases get delivery. Of course, not out here in our little village. But it has changed the restaurant culture. So again, back to your question about how are people surviving, the restaurant industry, most of the restaurant industry here is ma and pop. And most of it is run out of their homes. Japan treats land use and zoning very differently. So it's not uncommon for ma and pa to have a restaurant in the basement or in the first floor of their house and to live upstairs. Wow. So a lot of them own there's not big lease payments or mortgage payments or rents that they're having to pay. A lot of them don't have a ton of staff because, again, they don't have 200-seat restaurants here. It might be 10 or 15 seats where just the husband and wife, the couple are able to manage themselves. So there weren't mass layoffs. There weren't a whole bunch of people out of work. And in terms of, the office workers, the city workers, that's all continued. There's been very little effect to most of the industries. Now, when we talk about travel, again, Yosuke is an example. He works for a regional airport, and as I said, travel's down 97% in that airport. Yosuke works for it's a security company that's contracted to do all of the baggage security and the passenger screening as they go on. So they typically do a whole of 2 flights per day out of that airport, which has been down to 1 flight per day. With some days he says there's 5 people that get on the plane. Wow. And you really have to wonder, how does that continue? There's 70 plus people that work at that airport, and they're showing up for work every day. Now, be it, his 8-hour shift has become a 4-hour shift, but the company he works for has continued to pay him full wages.
Wow.
As if he was working full time the entire time. So again, it's been a silver lining for us, the fact that Yosuke has been able to maintain a full-time income, and we get to spend a lot more time together.
Cool.
In terms of the airlines, the larger corporations, I think where the Japanese government has really invested its COVID support is with the larger companies. I know that the airlines are massive for Japan, and they would never dare let transportation in Japan, moving people around the country. I've always marveled at how easy it is to get around the country. We can land in Tokyo and basically get to our home here, in the countryside of Akita, strictly on public transportation, whether it be
Nice.
planes or trains or something like that. So I think where the government has really invested in supports is those kinds of things. The larger corporations, keeping those big companies going, keeping the infrastructure of the country happening, right, is where they've put that in. And otherwise, there hasn't been a lot. When you watch the news in Japan, it's not like watching the news in Canada, where there's people struggling and wondering where, right, where their next paychecks. There's not a lot of that here. So it's a very, very different scenario in Japan versus what I'm seeing in the rest of the world.
So